Good morning, and welcome to Fridays with Frank, a lecture series sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Garry Wenske, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Frank Church Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture on War Peace, the American Role at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, C. Frederick Cornforth, and Community Development, Inc. for underwriting this series on how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. Thanks also to Peter and Allison Fenn for sponsoring today's session. Today's speakers will address Election 2020, what happened and why, an inside look at the new Biden administration. Our guest is J. Brian Atwood, a visiting scholar for international and public affairs at Brown University's Watson Institute. He is the former dean of the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and previously he served in numerous high-ranking government positions, including Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development and Undersecretary of State for Management and Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations. Joining him this morning is Peter Fenn, the founder of Fenn Communications. Previously, he served as Chief of Staff for Senator Frank Church, Executive Director of Democrats for the 80s. He was co-founder of the Center for Responsive Politics, and he's been a surrogate spokesman for numerous presidential campaigns. He also serves on the board of directors of both the Frank Church and the Robert Dole Institutes. Welcome to both of you, and a reminder to viewers who have questions for our speakers, please click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the session. Let's begin with Peter Fenn.
Thanks very much, Garry. And I want to thank my good friend and long-term colleague, Brian Atwood, for joining us today. It's a crucial time in American politics, and there's no better person to have with us today than Brian. And Brian and I go back quite a long ways. He worked in the Senate before he worked in the State Department for President Carter. He was with Tom Eagleton when I worked for Frank Church. So this professional relationship and friendship goes back many, many decades, and we can't stay off the phone with one another. So I'll just open this up by asking Brian a very simple question. As a foreign policy expert and as someone who ran the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee in the early 80s and as a great Paul, have you ever seen an election like this? And have you ever seen a post-election period like this, Brian?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Garry, for inviting me to speak to you today. And Peter's right. We've worked together for a long time and still close friends. And we kibitz on the telephone to get each other's ideas. So it's an extension of that relationship that we're doing today here. I've never seen anything like this. I don't think we've had anything like this in American history. It's kind of sad because clearly there's an effort to try to delegitimize the 7 million vote victory that President-elect Biden has had, and maybe to undercut, his first year as president and maybe more. I'm not sure I understand it. I think they say 70% of Republicans believe that this was a fraudulent election, but I think if you look deeper, I'm not sure that they really believe that. It seems to me we should be looking at the positive side, which is the tremendous integrity that some of the people, like the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, have shown. All of those people involved in vote counting around the country who basically stand behind what they've done. I mean, there have been 3 recounts in Georgia, and no noticeable change at all in the margin of victory. So I don't really understand it. I've never seen anything quite like it. It may well be that President Trump is simply trying to rationalize that he isn't really a loser and wants to raise a lot of money so that he can go out and be a factor in the future. But it's harmful. I mean, I think about the brave people of Belarus today who are still complaining about the way the election was stolen there. And if we energize a certain segment of our population to go out and campaign and have demonstrations, we look like Belarus. I mean, it's just really harmful to our foreign policy, harmful to our own democracy. I think probably you agree with that, Peter.
I do, and I find it quite disconcerting that we have over 100 Republican members of Congress who seem to want to buy off on the Texas lawsuit that probably will be dismissed, or I certainly hope it will be very quickly, by the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for this, Brian, and one is political fear. In other words, a lot of these folks are concerned about their own politics, their own re-elections, their own standing in their states. And so they feel that they have to sign on to something like this. And if you don't, that somehow you're going to lose the votes of large numbers of Republicans. And that's not exactly a profile in courage. I mean, the profiles in courage, as you point out, are coming from the Georgia Republican office holders, from the governor on down. And I think that you know, it might be a good, just for a second, to go over some of the interesting things about what happened with this election. And was it close? Marginally in some of these states, yes. But as you pointed out, this is over 7 million votes that President-elect Biden won by. 306 electoral votes. This isn't Florida in 2000. So, you know, and you have a situation where you look at what happened, and you can see that President-elect Biden did better in the suburbs by double digits than last time with Secretary Clinton. You see that independents voted by 12 points more for President-elect Biden. You know, you see a situation where there were vast numbers of people who were dissatisfied with the President of the United States and his conduct of the job. And so this really wasn't, you know, a cliffhanger in terms of an election. And as for votes stolen, I mean, you have people in state after state after state, you know, who are working their hearts out to take care of everybody's right to vote. And aside from rather bizarre accusations, there's no evidence to support that. So, you know, I think that it makes it is rather sad to see a situation developing. And I think all we can hope is that in the future, folks will back off that. And I think, you know, the next question really, Brian, and, you know, you've been through a lot of these wars. The next question is really what effect or what impact as the last month, or for that matter, the last 4 years in the campaign, what impact will that have on the ability of the Biden administration and those in Congress to actually get things done in the coming years?
Well, it's hard to tell. We're in the middle of a crisis. We're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis. So it was really important that the transition move on as quickly as possible so that the Biden people would know exactly, for example, how the vaccines would be distributed and what the deals were that were made with the companies that had produced the vaccine. It was good to see the FDA yesterday approve the Pfizer vaccine, but it's still a big question mark as to whether or not the people who really need the vaccine most will get it, and what the priorities are. What role will the U.S. military have in actually distributing the vaccines? All of these issues should have been vetted, discussed. I was the transition leader in 1992 when Clinton Gore won the election. And that was sort of the best of times. We had President George H.W. Bush, who was being very cooperative, but we still had a crisis in Haiti. The Haitian territory was surrounded by US ships and stopping people from leaving because there had been a military coup in Haiti. We had a crisis in Somalia that led eventually to the Black Hawk Down crisis. And I was spending every other week visiting with President Aristide of Haiti, who was living in an apartment about a block away from the State Department. So, and then we had people like the Swiss ambassador that would come to us and say that the Iranians wanted to open a dialogue. This was too soon after the hostage crisis. So even in the best of times, we're in a very vulnerable position during a transition. I mean, I think one has to say also on the positive side that 66% of the registered voters in this country voted. It's the highest percentage ever. Biden won more votes than any president ever. Actually, President Trump actually won more votes than any presidential candidate ever. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for this election, but it just seems to me that there's no graciousness whatsoever. I mean, when you lose an election, Hillary Clinton didn't come out that night. She came out the next day, called President Trump and congratulated him and conceded the election, even though it was a lot closer in all of those states that we're talking about right now than it is today. So it's just, I don't get it. I don't quite understand how President Trump became a cult figure, but I guess he is.
And you know, the basic bottom line of this, Brian, and maybe we're just pretty old on this, but this is not normal. I mean, this is not the way America operates. And this is not the way that America tells the world that democracies operate too. So, you know, that message is not a good message. But as you say, look, you know, there's an interesting Pew study which showed that in the year 2000, the Gore-Bush race, you know, when people were asked whether this election was crucial, was critical, was really important for the American people, or whether it was just another election, it doesn't make much difference who won, it was about 50-50. This year, 83% of Americans, so that's Republicans and Democrats, that's everybody, said this election was critical to the future of the country. Now, obviously, we have a polarized electorate, a polarized country. So people's view of how it's critical differs. But, you know, it is almost as though we need now to get back to regular order. And you know, the area that you're talking about, and the area that I think a lot of our voters and a lot of our viewers here are interested in is, what is the impact going to be on foreign policy? You know, what are the appointments portend? What do the changes look like now with the Biden administration, especially with someone who we all know at the Church Institute, Tony Blinken, and you know so well personally. What is your sense of the direction and the ability that they'll have to make things, as they say, normal again?
Well, normal in the international sphere means having alliances. I mean, the Trump administration talked about America first, but the real effect of the policies were America alone. And you can't deal with threats, whether they be transnational threats like climate change or global health pandemic, or refugee crises or whatever, unless you have alliances, unless you have people and institutions that are working with you. On the pandemic itself, for example, we dropped out of the World Health Organization and took the money away that they needed to try to deal with the pandemic. Now, no one is arguing that the World Health Organization was a perfect organization, but we were engaged even with the Ethiopian leader that was there, just appointed within the Trump years. We were engaged in an effort to try to reform that organization. It's not the time to reform an organization like that when they're in the middle of a crisis, and to drop out of it just because you're looking for someone to blame was so hurtful, not just to the World Health Organization, but to all of the member states that are participants in that. And just in terms of the vaccine distribution, it has to be global eventually. Obviously, America first. We want to make sure our most vulnerable people get the vaccine first, but you can't solve the pandemic unless you can stop it in other countries as well, because after all, that's where it came from. So the team that Biden has selected are people that he knows, that you and I know are very, very effective people. And the nice thing about it is that they work well together. Jake Sullivan, who comes from Minnesota, where I was for a while, is just known as one of the smartest people around, but also a very nice person. The same is true of Tony Blinken. He's tough enough to be the Secretary of State, but he's a really nice guy who everyone likes. So I think that helps a lot. And I just think they've got a team that knows Biden and Biden knows them. There's an old Dean Acheson saying that if you're a Secretary of State, you don't want any light showing between yourself and the president. Well, I mean, there's not going to be any light showing. Blinken's worked with Biden for years, and I'm sure he's going to have a great team. And it just seems to me all of these appointments, they not only reflect the diversity of America, which I think is a really good thing, but they're also, nobody questions their competence. And I think when you elect someone like a Joe Biden, he's been around for years, he knows everybody, and he's going to appoint the best people. And I just think that the difference between that and the various people that have run through the White House under Trump, I mean, you're not going to see firings every other week coming out of Joe Biden. These are people that know the area. They're going to have to also repair. And I mean, I think that for a while, there's a bit of a honeymoon with other friends. Europeans are just relieved that Joe Biden is there. They all know him. They all know his team. The same is true in Asia and other places where we're going to need to really strengthen those alliances. But I can tell you that after 4 years, where the Europeans are sitting around trying to figure out how they can deal with this erratic president of the United States, that it won't be as easy to change things in our favor. We're going to have to work at it. And I think that the team is the right one to work at it.
Now, where do you think things are going to go with Russia at this point, Brian? What do you think will conceivably change in our relationships with Putin?
Well, I could never understand the relationship that Trump had with Putin because whether it was Syria or whether it was interference in our election or whatever issue, he would take Putin's side versus our own intelligence agencies and our own State Department. I never understood it, and maybe one day historians will get to the bottom of it. But I think we've got to have a relationship with Russia that makes it very clear that they can't do the things that they've been doing. The worst thing they could do would be to interfere in the elections of either European countries or ours. But we also need to sit down and negotiate with them. We need to extend the nuclear pact with them, the arms control pact, and we need to sit down and see whether or not we can reach agreement on the intermediate nuclear weapons that threaten Europe so much. And in that, I think NATO and Europe will be very helpful. I mean, when we started after the Cold War ended, we actually tried to create a partnership for peace. We were actually asking Russia to come to NATO meetings. We were talking about joint maneuvers with the Russians. We were trying to bring them in. It's quite clear that some of the things that provoked them during the Bush administration, like the abolition of the ABM treaty, and the placement of nuclear weapons in what used to be the Warsaw Pact, Czech Republic and in Poland, provoked them. And they began to use some of their oil money to build back their military so that they could exercise influence within their own hegemonic region. But we got beyond that. I mean, we really have to show that NATO means what it says. We have to make sure that we can overtake what Trump did, which was to undermine the deterrent value of NATO by saying that when one nation is attacked, all nations are attacked. I mean, he basically undermined that, and we've got to reestablish the deterrent value of NATO. I don't want to use NATO, but the most important value of it is its deterrent effect, especially in places like the Balkans. So there's an awful lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and it is disappointing because and this isn't all on Trump by any stretch, but you know, when a lot of us were working with the National Democratic Institute, and you in the 90s were head of AID for for President Clinton, I went over a number of times to Russia, to Eastern European countries. There was real hope during that period after the wall fell that they could create an economy which worked, that they would move towards at least some semblance of democratization. There were some really strong leaders that were around during those periods, and it's been a while since Putin kicked the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican Institute out of Russia. They had nothing to do with any kinds of things. They viewed, his people viewed us as trying to interfere in their politics, and used us as clubs. And this same kind of thing is true, in Hungary. I mean, a number of us spent time in Hungary in those early years, and we're very hopeful. The Young People's Party, the party that we thought might be the most liberal party, was Fidesz. Fidesz now runs the country with an iron fist. I mean, they've, and the corruption is rampant, as it is in Russia. So, we got a lot of work to do. And it seems to me that if we have leadership and people within the administration that want to get things back on an even keel and to normalcy, and don't thrive in chaos, but rather try to reduce the amount of chaos that we confront, the better off we're gonna be.
Yeah. The other aspect of this is that we helped create the European Union. I mean, the Marshall Plan wasn't just an aid program, but it was an effort to try to integrate the economies of Europe so they wouldn't go to war with one another. The European Union is suffering, not just because of the pandemic, but because of Brexit and because of the actions of Hungary, the country you mentioned, and Poland. They just had a big proposal. Someone called it the Alexander Hamilton moment, the first time that they agreed to give a grant to the countries, a stimulus package, basically, to the countries that were suffering. And Poland and Hungary have blocked that. They've also blocked sanctions against Belarus, the country with the stolen election. And so now there's a real discussion within Europe as to whether or not they should change their rules so that they have modified majorities. So those two countries, or no one country, can basically veto a budget or a resolution on foreign policy. If Europe is strengthened, we will be strengthened, and we will have to then look at all the issues that they're looking at. I mean, they go after Google, they go after Facebook. So are several of our attorneys general in this country. I think privacy issues are important to the Europeans, and some of the laws they've passed within Europe maybe something we should be considering here.
Do you think that there is real opportunity to work with members of Congress and the Senate especially on some of these foreign policy matters? Obviously, China is an issue that there may be some shared approaches, but even Africa, South America, countries where our influence can work, especially with a robust and clear aid program and where we're bringing people together. Do you think there's an opportunity on some of these issues which aren't sort of front and center hot button issues like some of the domestic issues are, that we can see some real progress made because we've got some real pros in this new administration?
I do. I do think that there's a handful of Republicans that are very serious about foreign policy, national security issues. I worry a little bit about our descending into a real Cold War with China, but I think the Biden people want to just be smart about how we relate to China. I mean, there are some common interests like climate change and other things where we have common ground, but we've got to figure out a way to avoid a war over Taiwan, figure out a way to, in my opinion, to protect Taiwan's democracy, which NDI had a lot to do with, and to basically reestablish our friendships with countries like Japan and South Korea, where basically the Trump administration on South Korea, where we've got troops based, said, you've got to pay us a lot more money to keep our troops there. It's all become very transactional and make a deal with us, give us more money or whatever. I mean, it's in our interest to have good alliances there. I mean, I don't know right now, given the focus on the American economy and getting the middle class back up and working again, whether the TPP would be reopened. But that was not just an economic trade agreement, it was an effort to try to isolate China and to force them to conform with World Trade Organization rules. And I thought in that sense, it was geostrategically important, but it was, of course, thrown out immediately by the Trump administration. So there are a lot of issues that we need to be thinking about strategically in terms of how we deal with the Xi government in China, who's, of course, violating human rights terribly in Hong Kong and the Uyghur situation. We can't let them get away with that. They want to be an international power, then they need to stand up and defend indefensible actions that they've taken on human rights.
And all the more reason that we need an international community that keeps the pressure on them to do that. I mean, I think back to a long time ago to the Taiwan Relations Act, which you worked on as Assistant Secretary of State, that Frank Church was intimately involved with during that time. The Panama Canal treaties, which I still now consider the greatest non-issue of our time, but during that period it wasn't. And these were ticklish issues. These were issues that you had to bring people together on. These are issues where you needed bipartisan support. These were issues where you needed patience. You needed to be able to listen and to all sides. And some of these, were very, very contentious. So, we were able to do it. And I just, this may be a little preachy, but, I think back to not so long ago when Democrats and Republicans looked for someone from the other side to co-sponsor a bill with them. They reached out to the other side because they knew that the only way to get things done in the Congress of the United States was to do just that. That my way or the highway, one party or the other, wasn't likely to work. And the one thing that you have to say, and he's kind of derided for it because, I think the liberals don't like it, the conservatives don't like it, but Joe Biden lived that. That was Joe Biden's style. And he knows now that it's not 1980 again, that's for sure, 1990 even. But I still think that, you give some of these folks some credit for a different style of leadership, for a different approach. And this is really what the American people, it seems to me, want. You know, they're sick and tired of this. They don't want to see the sides, going after tooth and nail, this
right.
gladiator politics. So, that's, I mean, clearly Biden's campaign was about that. Clearly his early days as president-elect is about that. It's a hard sell, though.
Well, it's not only a hard sell, but Trump is trying to prevent it by forcing all of these members of Congress to not concede who won the election at this point. It's a shame, because this is the time when probably Mitch McConnell should be sitting down with Joe Biden, but he doesn't yet concede that Joe Biden won the election. So that's complicating things. And frankly, I think you're right. Most of the American people, even some that voted for Trump, want to see a unified country. They want to see this bickering in Washington end. They want to see some bipartisan activities, not just in the foreign policy area, but in some domestic issues where we really need the help. And some of the people that are really suffering right now, I'm encouraged that there is a group of centrists on both sides that are working on the stimulus package. But then it seems that the extremes get involved and say, well, let's pull back. And I've seen Bernie on television saying he wants X amount of money per family and for kids. And that sounds nice and great, but how far can the other side go? And then the other side pulls back, and you've got Ron Paul saying, I won't support anything. I just think it's now time. The American people are so frustrated. I'm sure the people of Idaho are just as far away as you are from Washington, wondering what in the world is going on back there when a crisis, when we have low interest rates, so it doesn't have that big an effect on the deficit, which, by the way, has grown under Trump exponentially. But the deficit, we need to stimulate the economy. We need to get small businesses back in operation. We need to get the vaccine out to people. We need state and local governments not to be firing firemen and police and teachers because they don't have the money. It's just really, it begs action, and it begs bipartisan action in Washington.
Well, right now, the hope obviously is that something will be passed before the end of this year, because people know that if it's not, then basically what happens is, renters are kicked out of their apartments.
Right.
People aren't able to feed their families. There's a story today about someone who had to stop her drugs. She was an amazing mother, grandmother, person who cleaned the offices of the Pew Charitable Trust here in Washington, beloved. And because she was laid off, she couldn't pay for her drugs, and she died of COVID. And because she couldn't get the drugs that she needed. And, we can't operate in a country where, because of bickering in Washington, we allow those kinds of things to happen. And I think that one of the hardest things is to see the difference in how this affects people on the lower income side of things, people who are Black or Hispanic or Native American, people who live in rural areas. Idaho has a lot of folks in rural areas who, they may have been doing okay for a while, but the local coffee shop is shut down. Their local businesses have pulled way back. They've had to lay off people. And if those unemployment checks don't come, if there's not food for people, then we're into a 1930s situation for many Americans. So not to get too rhetorical here, but I think that your point is right, which is that the time is the sand's running out of the hourglass. and we got to do something back here. And
Right.
I hope it gets done.
Yeah.
The one thing that I was also interested in your view on, and you dealt with it a little bit, is what do you think the impact is going to be on those civil servants, those middle managers, those people that are making government run well, who have been kind of attacked in this last 4 years? In that rebuilding is something, I mean, you've been involved in a lot of that. What do you see as ways to boost people's appreciation for being public servants?
Doesn't help the morale of the civil service to have the president sign an executive order saying that basically they can be fired willy-nilly without process, which is essentially what he's done a couple of months ago. That sends a really negative, and I don't think, frankly, every time he signs an executive order, it goes to court, and I don't think he'll probably win on that. And in any case, it will be reversed as soon as Biden becomes president. So, but the morale is horrible. They call it the deep state, and never quite understood why all of a sudden with a Republican president that the intelligence community and even the military to some extent would be seen as the enemy. And to say nothing of the State Department, which has been hollowed out in the extreme. So many very talented, top-notch people have left government. So it's time to restore government, and let's hope too that many of these government agencies have become too bureaucratic. And when we were in office in the Clinton-Gore years, Gore led an effort to try to streamline government and make it more responsive to the people. I think another effort of that type is needed now because it's not only the hollowing out process of good people leaving, but you can replace them. But if you don't have a bureaucratic structure that works efficiently, then they'll also be very demoralized and won't feel that their voices are being heard. So building back better is a really nice theme for Biden, and it has to have some meaning in terms of the way these bureaucracies operate. I mentioned before the national security team seems to be one that will work very well together. But I've mentioned to Tony Blinken that he needs to streamline that State Department, because I said to him, probably shouldn't be saying this out, but I said, you know, that the person who has the information that you really need may be someone so far down the bureaucracy that you never get to her, and it could be her. But it's true, but he came back and said he knows that. Of course, he was a deputy secretary of state, so he knows the situation.
Right, right. Well, it reminds me of the old Kennedy story that he would pick up the phone, President Kennedy, and he would call a desk officer for a country. And the desk officer for Afghanistan's going, hello, Mr. President. And well, what can I do for you? I mean, they're not used to getting those calls. And, you know, one of the things I think that we can look towards, and as you know, and Garry knows, and some others, you know, my father worked for President Kennedy in the White House, and his job was to recruit people for top level jobs in the Kennedy administration in the so-called New Frontier. And he, throughout his whole life, always had tremendous respect and admiration for those people who served in government. And I do think, and maybe this is the Pollyanna in me, but I do think that now is a time when people will say, you know, I want to contribute. I want to do something. I want to be involved. My guess is, and I've heard some talk about this, you may know a lot more about it, but there are an awful lot of people who are applying for jobs in this government, not for self-aggrandizement, not to be big shots, but because they want to contribute and to do something. It's the old, again, Hubert Humphrey, you know well, and Kennedy, Peace Corps mentality. that you want to give back to your country. And maybe at some point we'll finally get into universal service in this country, which I think would be extraordinary for people in their late teens and early 20s to work out in the house things. The other point I would raise is, it's often said that government works best when it's closest to the people. And maybe one of the things that we ought to look at, especially with a lot of these federal agencies, everybody doesn't have to be around Washington. I mean, they can be out in the countryside. We could move some of these operations, Bureau of Land Management, Department of Agriculture, which already have a lot of local folks. But even moving some headquarters a little bit outside of Washington may not be such a terrible thing.
Peter mentioned, you both mentioned Anthony Blinken. The Frank Church Institute sponsored him and at Boise State last year. And one of the questions that's been posed is, what are some of the challenges the State Department faces to improve and restore America's image abroad?
Well, I mean, I think I've addressed some of that. I do think we need to participate again in international organizations. There's always a fear, if we contribute to the UN, we're giving up some of our sovereignty. Well, sovereignty is an 18th century concept, and it's with all of the supply chains and different relationships that people have around the world and their ability to talk to one another over Zoom like we're doing now has changed the world considerably. And so there are so many things that are that don't pay attention to national borders. Well, we need to participate in these organizations to advance our own interests. So I think it's very positive that we're going to be naming a very effective former Foreign Service officer to be the ambassador to the United Nations. We'll have to, on day one, get back into the World Health Organization and work with the World Health Organization to strengthen that organization and to use it to distribute vaccines and other things. There's just so much to be done to reestablish friendships. I mean, we're not going to be able to dominate the world as we once did. And so therefore we need friends, we need allies, and we need to be working on common transnational issues that we can't handle the effects of climate change all by ourselves. We've got to work with others. And it's encouraging that John Kerry, who was a very active Secretary of State, is now going to be the sort of climate czar. I think he'll get some things done. We also have to pass some legislation in our own country. That's not going to be easy if you're dealing with climate deniers. We're going to have to pass some legislation that gives us credibility to work with other countries on that issue. So there's so much that I could go on for an hour, but I know you want to ask some more questions, so I won't.
Yeah, you have several, I guess.
President-elect Biden has nominated some well-known and competent appointees, but there's been some criticism that he's relying on well-known and competent people who have served in previous administrations. What about the idea that he should appoint some visionary appointees and try to hit a home run?
Well, first of all, yeah, and I'll let Brian, take this too. But I think some of these people are pretty visionary. I mean, he's got some folks who just because they're experienced and been around doesn't mean they don't have vision. John Kerry, as Brian said, has got a lot of vision when it comes to the whole issue of climate change, and a lot of experience. I think that there's no question that there will be people involved in this administration who are new to the game, who are younger, who really will be putting out alternative approaches. And I think this is the one thing that all of us who have worked with with President-elect Biden over so many decades, this is the way he likes to operate. He likes to have different ideas, different visions, different approaches. And he's been in situations where that's terribly important. That was the kind of advice that he gave to Barack Obama. He wasn't always a yes man with Barack Obama. So he's not looking, I don't think, for a group of people that all think the same. But, one key point Brian made, I think, is, and no matter how, good people these people are, these are people who are incredibly smart and they have big egos. And, you can go back to administration after administration and fights between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. With this group, they all know each other. They all like each other so far, anyway. I'm not saying everybody, but I think you've got a fairly coherent, cohesive group of folks that are serving the best interests of the country. Brian.
No, I would agree with that. And I thought what you were going to ask is not, is he going to put visionaries in? Because I think Peter's right. Some of them are visionaries. I thought you were going to ask whether he was going to appoint a Republican to the cabinet. We'll see. I'm not sure.
So I'll ask that question. Will he?
There are still some open spaces there for a Republican. We'll see.
Speaking of Republicans, the Idaho Republicans seem split. The Idaho Attorney General did not join the Texas lawsuit, claiming it infringed on Idaho's sovereignty, which I thought was an interesting argument. Both Idaho congressmen have signed on to it, though. So there, I don't know if you want to comment on these splits around the country.
Only to say that these are people that signed on to this that really believe in states' rights. That they strongly support the Electoral College system, which I think needs to be looked at. But it's so ironic that they would attack other states' electoral systems just to satisfy President Trump, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think a state like Idaho, which is very conservative, very Republican, by and large, but has a lot of common sense too. A lot of people do, and for the Attorney General to do what he did, he knew he had to look at himself in the mirror the next day, and it's probably is going to help, at least in the short term, his political any political ambitions he might have, just like those folks in Georgia too. But end of the day, I think people come around on this. And, as Brian said at the beginning, I think you have a situation where people will rethink, in the heat of the moment, with all the rhetoric and the desire to go along with Trump. After this sort of dust settles, I think folks who have stood up for principle will be looked upon very favorably. I was actually a little surprised that both members of Congress from Idaho supported the Texas suit. I guess I wasn't surprised at one of them, but I was a little surprised at the other, to be honest.
Well, I think we've actually covered most of the questions that have been submitted, so I'll leave it to you to ask if you want to make any closing statements.
Well, we can do that. I do have one thing I want to ask Brian before we kind of close things up here, and that is the use of the bully pulpit as president, the ability that a president has now to, which certainly Trump showed in 4 years, to almost dominate the news and dominate the messaging. One of the things that Barack Obama has talked about, even in his new book, is that he wasn't sure he had a lot on his plate, but he wasn't sure he explained things to people as well as he should, that he sold the successes of some of the things that he did as best as he could. And I wonder with this administration, how important using the bully pulpit is in turning some things around in this country.
I don't think you can appeal to people's patriotism enough. I mean, the problem today, and the problem that Obama had as well, was the sort of the echo chambers of Fox News and CNN and all of the different people coming out. I mean, journalism has turned into an ideological advocacy. And so every president who gives a speech is going to be attacked, no matter which side. But we're just absolutely exhausted as a country in hearing one tweet after the other. And I don't think you're going to see that coming out of Joe Biden. You may see more addresses to the nation on crucial issues, and I think he needs to do that. But you have to expect that there's still going to be polarization, and how do you deal with it? I mean, I do think part of it is the constant message that we're a unified country and that we need to be unified, and you're still not going to, that message won't get through to 20 to 30%, but it's more dangerous when it's 50% who are opposing everything you stand for.
The other thing, Brian, it seems to me that you'll see is more regular press briefings out of the White House, out of the State Department, out of the Defense Department on issues which are of concern. A much more, one might say, a truth-telling operation. I think that one of the things that we've got to do in this country is we have to figure out a way to make sure that what used to be kind of the 3%ers, those people who may have been John Birch Society members and railed against the Trilateral Commission, or the Rockefellers controlling everything in this country, or whatever conspiracy theory they were buying at the moment. I mean, no one paid a lot of attention to them because there was such a small number of people. Well, now, sadly, because of our media environment, those are the 30% or 40% in some cases, certainly. And one party or the other just gravitates to some of that. So it does seem to me that one of the things that this administration has to figure out and how to deal with is to take very seriously truth, and to take very seriously facts, and to take very seriously that if we don't question the veracity of not the motives of somebody, but the veracity of what we're getting out of QAnon or of these organizations, or of MSNBC, of CNN. I don't care who it is, but if somebody is not telling the truth, it'd be best to have Democrats take on Democrats when they go over the top, to be perfectly honest, and Republicans take on Republicans. But I sense that unless we kind of get that under some semblance of control, we're in trouble. And the other part of that seems to me to be a basic understanding of civics, of what this country is all about, of what the history of this country. I don't think we have ever had a president of the United States who had such a little understanding of the history. He doesn't read. I mean, he didn't really know what was going on at Pearl Harbor. I mean, what is that about? At least, as reported, talking about our military the way he did. I mean, it seems to me that we have to move very quickly beyond distortions and lies and untruths and get back on track.
Absolutely agree.
On that point, one last question: how does President-elect Biden, reach out to those who did not support him?
I think he's indicated he wants to do this. Obviously, with the COVID crisis going on, it's difficult for him to move around the country. But I think one of the things he'll have to do will be to visit a lot of the red states, and give talks to people. And I just think that it's more than just appearing on television. It's good. They've got to see him personally and see that he's genuine, which that's his biggest attribute. He's a genuine thinking and feeling person. He's empathetic. And I don't think they're used to seeing, we haven't seen empathy for the last 4 years. It'd be good to see that in a president.
I think that's so important. It's such a great point, Brian. Some of our folks at Boise State may remember that that Barack Obama, after he was reelected in 2012, one of his first stops after he was inaugurated again was to come to Boise State University. Bob Krustra was in the Illinois State Senate with Barack Obama. And he was a Republican, Barack Obama, obviously a Democrat, but they understood one another, and they understood what America was all about. And I think the notion of going to red states, going to rural areas, and look, you know, some of it could be rough. You might get booed, but you know, I mean that happens. But you know, you're reaching out, and right now we need a lot of reaching out. I think great.
I just have to say one thing about in Idaho and Boise State. My nephew played football against Boise State, and he's never played on a blue football field before. It shows that how innovative and creative Boise State and Idaho are.
Well, and some of you may not know, but Brian got a scholarship to Boston University as I was a tight end or an end anyway. He's a pretty tall fella, and he was a really good football player. So that started your career.
Thank you, Peter.
On that note, then, we will end this session, and thank you both to Peter and to Brian for their presentations. And for our viewers, if you appreciate these sessions, I hope you will go to the Frank Church Institute website and make a contribution. And we look forward to carrying on more of these next spring. Thank you for today, and good day.